The 17th of January 1944, 0230 hours, Philippine Sea. The water was black glass under a moonless sky. Commander Richard O'Kane stood in the conning tower of USS Tang, his hands steady on cold steel, eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes cutting through the night 3,000 yards ahead. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel. Beneath him, the submarine's hull creaked with the pressure of shallow submersion, a sound like the breathing of some mechanical leviathan. In the torpedo room, 18 fish lay cradled in their tubes, 9 forward, 9 aft, each one a 2-ton messenger of American industrial might. O'Kane had trained for this moment through countless drills in the waters off Pearl Harbor, but no training could prepare a man for what he was about to attempt. A complete torpedo expenditure in a single engagement, a mathematical exercise in destruction that would either write his name in naval history or send 40 men to the bottom of the Pacific. The convoy ahead was designated Convoy High 71, though the men who sailed aboard those ships knew it simply as their lifeline. 17 merchant vessels and their escorts, carrying rubber, tin, aviation fuel, and 15,000 tons of rice from Singapore to the home islands. Japan's empire, stretched thin across 10,000 miles of occupied territory, depended on such convoys the way a body depends on blood. Cut the arteries, and the empire would bleed. The American submarine force understood this with the cold clarity of surgeons. They had been cutting those arteries since December 1941, but by early 1944 they had refined the technique into something approaching an art form. O'Kane gave the order. His voice carried no dramatic emphasis, just the flat professional tone of a man reading coordinates. The first torpedo left its tube with a pneumatic hiss, and the submarine shuddered as compressed air expelled 2 tons of weapon into the sea. Then another, and another. In the span of 90 seconds, 9 torpedoes were running hot and true toward the convoy, their electric motors leaving almost no wake in the darkness. O'Kane did not wait to observe the results. He ordered the submarine hard to port, bringing the stern tubes to bear, and fired the remaining 9 fish in a textbook maneuver that would become legend in the silent service. 18 torpedoes, 1 run. The mathematics were simple and terrible. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Second World War with a confidence bordering on spiritual certainty. Their admirals had studied Mahan and Corbett, understood the theories of decisive battle and sea control, and had built a fleet designed to dominate the Pacific through superior gunnery and carrier aviation. The submarine, in Japanese naval doctrine, was a weapon for fleet action, a tool to weaken enemy capital ships before the decisive surface engagement. The idea of using submarines primarily against merchant shipping struck many Japanese officers as beneath the dignity of a warrior service. Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded confrontation with military opponents, not the hunting of civilian cargo vessels in the dark. American naval doctrine had no such philosophical constraints. The United States Navy entered the war with a submarine force that understood its primary mission with brutal clarity. Wage unrestricted warfare against Japanese commerce. Sink the tankers. Sink the cargo ships. Sink the troop transports. Strangle the empire economically and logistically until its war machine ground to a halt for lack of fuel and raw materials. It was not romantic. It was not particularly honorable by traditional naval standards. It was devastatingly effective. By January 1944, the campaign had been underway for more than 2 years, and the statistics told a story that Japanese naval planners were only beginning to comprehend in its full horror. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate of approximately 100,000 tons per month. Japan's merchant fleet, which had totaled roughly 6 million tons at the war's beginning, was hemorrhaging ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The empire was slowly suffocating, and the men aboard Convoy High 71 were trying to deliver one more breath of oxygen to a dying patient. The first explosion came 38 seconds after launch. Torpedo number 3 struck a cargo vessel amidships, detonating against the hull with a crack that carried across the water like breaking bone. The ship's back broke almost immediately. Within seconds, she was folding in on herself, the forward and aft sections rising as the middle sank into the Black Sea. Men were thrown into the watermen who moments before had been sleeping in cramped bunks or standing watch, dreaming of home, of wives and children waiting in Yokohama or Kobe. Now they were swimming in oil-slicked water in the darkness, calling out to each other in voices already hoarse with panic. The second explosion followed 10 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth. The night transformed into a sequence of orange blooms against black canvas, each detonation illuminating the convoy for a brief moment before darkness crashed back down. Aboard USS Tang, the crew listened to the impacts through the hydrophones, each one a deep, resonant boom, followed by the sounds of metal tearing, bulkheads collapsing, and the terrible groaning of ships dying. Some men kept count. Others simply listened in awed silence to the arithmetic of destruction. Commander O'Kane had fired 18 torpedoes. 16 found targets. 2 merchants broke apart and sank within minutes. 3 more were crippled, listing heavily, fires spreading across their decks as aviation fuel leaked from ruptured tanks. An escort destroyer took a torpedo meant for a larger vessel and lost her bow entirely, the forward third of the ship simply vanishing in a geyser of white water. She would sink within the hour. Another merchant, her engine room flooded, went dead in the water and began a slow death spiral that would take her down by the stern before dawn. The convoy scattered like birds flushed from cover, each captain making the instinctive decision to save his own ship rather than maintain formation. It was the correct decision for individual survival. It was catastrophic for collective defense. In the span of less than 5 minutes, Convoy High 71 had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. 9 ships would ultimately be lost that night. The remainder would limp into Manila Bay days later, carrying only a fraction of their original cargo, traumatized crews testifying to an attack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Japanese submarine officers had been trained to expect a certain parity in warfare. They operated submarines that were often superior in many technical respects to their American counterparts, faster, longer-ranged, equipped with the deadly Type 95 torpedo that could strike from distances exceeding 20,000 yards. They expected to face American warships crewed by men of similar training and comparable equipment. What they had not expected, what no amount of training at the Naval Academy in Itajima could have prepared them for, was the sheer industrial asymmetry of the conflict they were fighting. By early 1944, the United States was launching new submarines at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war planners. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Electric Boat Company, Mare Island, and other facilities were producing fleet submarines Gato-class and Balao-class boats with a regularity that transformed submarine warfare from a specialized craft into an assembly line process. Each new boat carried 24 torpedoes, state-of-the-art radar, sophisticated fire control systems, and a crew trained to standards that reflected America's vast investment in technical education and simulation training. These were not merely weapons. They were floating factories of destruction, backed by a logistics system that could keep them at sea for months at a time, replenish their torpedoes at forward bases, and rotate crews to prevent the psychological deterioration that came with extended combat operations. The Japanese submarine force, by contrast, was being consumed by missions that had nothing to do with commerce raiding. Japanese submarines were used to ferry supplies to isolated garrisons, to transport troops, to conduct reconnaissance operations that put them at risk without inflicting corresponding damage on the enemy. Japanese submariners were extraordinarily brave. Their casualty rates would ultimately reach nearly 80%, but bravery without strategic coherence is merely expensive sacrifice. They were dying in submarines used as cargo vessels, trying to deliver rice to starving soldiers on bypassed islands, while American submarines roamed the vital sea lanes with impunity, severing Japan's economic jugular 1 torpedo at a time. Commander O'Kane surfaced USS Tang 40 minutes after the attack, far from the chaos he had created, but close enough to hear the secondary explosions still echoing across the water. He needed to ventilate the boat, recharge the batteries, and confirm his kills through periscope observation at first light. The crew emerged from the torpedo room with faces showing the peculiar mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion that follows combat. They had just expended every torpedo aboard in a single engagement, an accomplishment without precedent in submarine warfare. Some men permitted themselves brief smiles, others simply sat on the deck plates, hands shaking from adrenaline depletion, unable to fully process what they had just done. There was food waiting for them in the galley, hot coffee, sandwiches made with fresh bread that would go stale within days, canned fruit cocktails served in small bowls. It was unremarkable food by civilian standards, but to men who had spent hours at battle stations, operating in silence with death potentially seconds away, it represented something more than mere sustenance. It represented the casual abundance of a nation whose industrial capacity could afford to feed submariners well, even while prosecuting a global war across multiple theaters. Japanese submariners, when they returned to port, were often greeted with rations that reflected an empire already experiencing severe shortages. Rice mixed with barley to extend supply, fish that was marginally fresh, dried vegetables that had lost most of their nutritional value. The American submariners ate fresh bread and complained if the coffee was lukewarm. This contrast was not merely about food. It was about the fundamental economic equation underlying the entire Pacific War. The United States possessed productive capacity that exceeded Japan's by a factor of approximately 10-1 in steel production, 20-1 in oil production, and incalculable margins in the sophisticated industrial processes required to produce radar, fire control computers, and the complex optical systems that made American submarines such lethal hunters. Every American torpedo carried within it the accumulated technological sophistication of a nation that had spent decades building universities, investing in research, and creating an industrial ecosystem capable of translating theoretical knowledge into practical weapons with breathtaking efficiency. The Japanese convoy escort commanders who survived the attack on High 71 filed reports that attempted to make sense of the chaos. They described a coordinated assault by multiple submarines, possibly as many as 3 or 4 boats working in concert. The idea that a single submarine could carry and effectively deliver 18 torpedoes in a single engagement struck them as implausible. Their own submarines typically carried 14 to 17 torpedoes, and Doctrine emphasized careful conservation of weapons. The notion of expending an entire loadout in minutes seemed wasteful, almost reckless, the action of a force that had torpedoes to spare, that could afford to be profligate with weapons because more were always available at the next forward base. They were correct in that assessment, though they could not have understood its full implications. USS Tang would return to Pearl Harbor, rearm completely in a matter of days, and return to the patrol area within 3 weeks. The torpedoes that replaced the 18 she had fired were already in production when she launched her attack, rolling off assembly lines in factories where workers, many of them women, who had never considered industrial labor before the war, were turning out weapons with the same efficiency that their factories had once produced automobiles. The American war economy had converted its massive consumer production capacity into a military production capacity without seriously degrading civilian living standards. Americans at home still ate well, still went to movies, still bought war bonds with money earned from overtime shifts. The Japanese home front, by early 1944, was already on subsistence rations and would only grow hungrier as the submarine blockade tightened. There was a photograph taken of Commander O'Kane and his crew after USS Tang returned from that patrol. It shows 40 men arranged on the submarine's deck, squinting into bright Hawaiian sunlight, some smiling, others maintaining the stoic expression that service members adopt for official photographs. O'Kane stands in the center, his bearing confident but not theatrical. These were not men who believed they were engaged in anything glorious. They understood their work in more pragmatic terms as a necessary task executed with professional competence, but there was something else in their faces, a quality that would become increasingly visible in photographs of American servicemen as the war progressed. The unconscious assurance of men who knew that the industrial system behind them was inexhaustible, that every weapon expended would be replaced, that the nation backing them had resources so vast that shortage was not a concept they needed to seriously consider. Japanese submariners operated under no such assurance. By 1944, They were acutely aware that every torpedo fired might be the last for some time, that spare parts were becoming scarce, that the sophisticated optical equipment in their periscopes could not be easily replaced if damaged. They fought with the careful deliberation of men managing scarcity, while their American counterparts fought with the aggressive initiative of men who knew that abundance was their strategic weapon. This psychological difference was as tactically significant as any difference in hull design or torpedo technology. The symbolic object of that night, of that entire campaign, was perhaps the torpedo itself, not as a weapon, but as a manufactured artifact representing the philosophical divide between the two submarine forces. The American Mark 14 torpedo had entered the war plagued with problems: faulty magnetic detonators, depth control issues, circular runs that endangered the launching submarine. The defects were real and killed American submariners through 1,943. But the American system, bureaucratic, frustrating, often resistant to field reports, eventually corrected those problems through a combination of persistent advocacy by submarine commanders, technical investigation, and the simple fact that American industry could afford to produce thousands of torpedoes for testing and modification until the weapon worked as intended. The Japanese Type 95 torpedo was, in many respects, a superior weapon when functioning correctly. It was faster, had longer range, and its oxygen propulsion system left almost no visible wake. But when problems emerged, and problems always emerge with complex weapons, the Japanese system lacked the industrial capacity and institutional flexibility to implement comprehensive fixes. Torpedoes were too valuable to expend in extensive testing. The feedback loop between operational forces and development facilities was longer and more bureaucratic. The result was a weapon that remained finicky and inconsistent, operated by men who had learned to work around its limitations rather than demanding that the system fix them. This pattern repeated across virtually every system in the war. American forces could afford to fail, learn, adapt, and overwhelm problems with resources. Japanese forces had to succeed immediately or accept chronic deficiency. It was the difference between a wealthy nation experimenting with multiple solutions to the same problem and a resource-constrained nation forced to commit to a single approach and hope it proved adequate. In the weeks following the destruction of Convoy High 71, Japanese naval intelligence analysts added the incident to a growing file of similar attacks. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. American submarines were operating with increasing boldness, attacking convoys in waters that had previously been considered relatively secure, and doing so with a tactical sophistication that suggested excellent intelligence, superior radar, and aggressive command philosophy. What the analysts could not fully quantify, what remained partially obscured by the fog of war and institutional reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, was the strategic catastrophe unfolding across the Pacific shipping lanes. Japan was an island empire absolutely dependent on imported resources. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Indochina, iron ore from Malaya, rubber from Thailand. Every one of these resources travelled by sea, and every sea lane was becoming a hunting ground for American submarines. By mid-1944, Japanese merchant shipping losses would exceed 1 million tons in a single year. The empire's merchant marine was being destroyed faster than industrial production could replace it, and the second-order effects were beginning to cascade through the entire war economy. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials. Training of new pilots was curtailed to conserve aviation fuel. Civilian rations were cut repeatedly as rice imports failed to reach the home islands. The empire was being starved, not by blockade in the traditional sense, but by a submarine campaign of such relentless effectiveness that it functioned as a slow-motion economic apocalypse. Japanese submariners understood what was happening. They saw the diminishing convoys, observed the increasing number of ships sailing alone because organized convoys had become impossible to assemble, noted the desperate measures being taken to route ships through shallow coastal waters, where submarines theoretically had difficulty operating. Some kept private journals entries written in careful characters, recording observations that could not be included in official reports. These journals, recovered after the war, reveal a growing awareness that the submarine war was lost, that American boats controlled the sea in ways that surface fleets could not effectively contest, and that the Empire's strategic situation was deteriorating irreversibly. Commander O'Kane would conduct 4 more war patrols in USS Tang, each one adding to an accumulated record of destruction that would make him one of the most successful submarine commanders in American naval history. But the pattern established that night in January 1944, the willingness to expend all weapons in a single decisive engagement, trusting that more would be available, became standard doctrine across the submarine force. American boats hunted not to conserve resources, but to inflict maximum damage as quickly as possible. They took risks that would have been unthinkable for forces operating under scarcity, and those risks paid strategic dividends, because the industrial base behind them could absorb losses and replenish expended weapons without hesitation. The Japanese submarine force never adopted similar tactics because they could not afford to. A Japanese submarine that expended its full loadout would face weeks, possibly months, before full rearming. The torpedoes might not be available. The forward base might have been bypassed by American advances. The boat itself might be reassigned to supply duty, its offensive capability sacrificed to logistical necessity. Japanese submariners learned to fire carefully, to husband their weapons, to accept that a single opportunity might be the only opportunity for an entire patrol. They became defensive in their tactical thinking, not because they lacked courage, but because scarcity had imposed caution as the only rational response. The night of the 17th of January 1944 was not a turning point in the submarine war. Turning points are dramatic, visible, decisive. The submarine war had no such moment. It was instead a campaign of accumulation, thousands of individual attacks, thousands of cargo vessels sent to the bottom, millions of tons of resources prevented from reaching their destinations. The destruction of Convoy High 71 was significant not because it changed the trajectory of the war, but because it exemplified the fundamental dynamics that were already determining the outcome. Years after the war, historians would analyze shipping records, decode intercepted Japanese communications, and reconstruct the full scope of the submarine campaign. They would discover that the American submarine force, which never numbered more than roughly 200 boats in active service at any given time, had sunk approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels totaling nearly 5 million tons. They had also sunk 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 200 other naval vessels. The submarine force represented approximately 1.6% of the total American military forces in the Pacific, but it accounted for approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. The return on investment was extraordinary. The strategic impact was decisive. Japanese submariners, by contrast, sank approximately 180 Allied merchant vessels, totaling roughly 1 million tons, a respectable figure by any standard, except when compared to what American submarines accomplished. The Japanese submarine force also suffered catastrophic casualties, 128 boats lost out of roughly 190 that saw combat, a loss rate that approached 70%. They fought bravely, often brilliantly, but they fought within a strategic framework that had assigned them missions incompatible with their best capabilities and failed to recognize that the submarine war was fundamentally an economic war, not a military one in the traditional sense. There is a recording, preserved in naval archives, of Commander O'Kane being interviewed years after the war. His voice is measured, thoughtful, absent the triumphalism that popular culture often associates with successful combat commanders. When asked about that night in January 1944, about the decision to fire all 18 torpedoes, he describes it not as boldness but as simple tactical logic. The targets were available, the geometry was favorable, the weapons were at hand. The decision to fire was almost mechanical, the correct application of available resources to achieve maximum effect. But then he pauses and adds something that reveals a deeper understanding of what he and his crew had actually accomplished. "We knew," he said, "that there would be more torpedoes waiting when we got back. We always knew that. It changes how you fight when you know the war can afford your decisions." That single observation encapsulates perhaps the most significant advantage American forces possessed throughout the Pacific War. They fought knowing that the nation behind them could afford their expenditures, could replace their losses, could sustain operations indefinitely, because the industrial and economic base supporting them was essentially inexhaustible within the time frame of the conflict. Japanese forces fought knowing the opposite, that every loss was potentially irreplaceable, that every expenditure drew down a finite reserve, that time was working against them because the balance of resources grew more unfavorable with each passing month. The symbolism of 18 torpedoes finding 16 targets extends beyond the immediate tactical success. It represents the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, one based on abundance, industrial, mass production, and the willingness to accept short-term inefficiency in exchange for long-term overwhelming force. The other, based on conservation, precision, and the attempt to achieve victory through qualitative superiority and superior fighting spirit when quantitative superiority was impossible. History records which approach proved superior, but the human cost of that lesson was paid by men in the water, swimming in darkness, calling out for help that would not arrive in time. The submarine campaign in the Pacific was a war fought in darkness and silence, far from the dramatic carrier battles and island invasions that dominate popular memory. But it was perhaps the most strategically decisive campaign of the entire Pacific War. The slow strangulation of an empire that depended absolutely on sea communications and found those communications severed by an enemy with unlimited osmotive, patience, unlimited resources, and a submarine force that had learned to fight with the cold efficiency of an industrial process. The Japanese Navy entered the war believing that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that superior training and bushido could compensate for inferior numbers and production capacity. The submarine war disproved that belief, one convoy at a time, one torpedo at a time, until the accumulated weight of losses made continued resistance merely a question of how long pride could substitute for fuel, steel, and rice. In the final analysis, what happened when 18 torpedoes hit in one run was this. Japan lost not merely a convoy, but confronted in microcosm the strategic reality that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. They faced an enemy that could afford to be profligate with weapons because abundance was its fundamental strategic asset. They faced a nation that could simultaneously feed its population well, supply forward combat units with everything they needed, and maintain industrial production at levels that made shortages conceptually foreign to the men doing the fighting. They faced a system that treated submarines not as precious limited resources to be carefully husbanded, but as industrial products to be mass-produced, expended, and replaced in a continuous cycle of destruction and replenishment. The night was still dark when USS Tang slipped beneath the surface and set course for her patrol area, looking for more convoys, more targets, more opportunities to apply the brutal mathematics of submarine warfare. Behind her, men were drowning in oil-slicked water, ships were settling onto the seafloor 3,000 feet below, and the empire those ships had been trying to sustain was one step closer to the starvation and collapse that would arrive 15 months later. The submarine did not linger to observe the consequences of her attack. She had done what she was designed to do, and there would be more work tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the enemy's merchant fleet no longer existed as a functional force. That was the nature of submarine warfare in the Pacific, relentless, cumulative, and ultimately as decisive as any carrier battle, though far less visible and far less celebrated. The sea has kept most of its secrets from that night. The exact coordinates where those ships went down, the names of all the men who died in the water, the final thoughts of captains who went down with their vessels, these details are lost to history, preserved only in incomplete records and the silence of deep water. But the strategic lesson remains clear, written in lost statistics and convoy records, and the ultimately unsuccessful attempts by Japanese planners to sustain an empire that depended on ships that no longer reached their destinations. 18 torpedoes changed nothing and everything, nothing in the immediate strategic picture, everything in what they represented about the nature of the war being fought, and the inevitable outcome that had been determined not when the first torpedo was fired, but years earlier when two nations with vastly different industrial capacities decided that their differences could only be resolved through total war. The abundance that allowed USS Tang to fire 18 torpedoes in a single engagement was the same abundance that would ultimately place American forces on the shores of Japan itself. The submarine war was merely the maritime expression of that fundamental asymmetry, asymmetry in resources, in industrial capacity, in the ability to sustain losses and continue operations, and ultimately in the philosophical approach to warfare itself. One side fought to conserve, the other fought to expend. History records which approach was vindicated, but the validation came at a cost measured in thousands of lives lost in darkness, far from home, in a war that neither side could afford to lose, but that only one side could afford to win.